Hello everyone. Welcome to the PJ Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy and the UWI TV's Africa Caribbean Reasoning podcast series. My name is Paulette Ramsay, and it is my great pleasure to invite you all to join us on a monthly basis for compelling conversations with experts, scholars, thought leaders, and advocates from across the globe. Our guests will share their unique insights into issues that shape the African and Caribbean regions and their diasporas. Also, we invite you to check the UWI schedule in your area, as they will be broadcasting our programs from time to time. You will not want to miss all these thought-provoking sessions. Today, our special guest is Professor Rupert Lewis, who is a distinguished scholar known for his contributions to the fields of political thought, black thought, diaspora studies, and philosophy. Professor Lewis is a prolific interdisciplinary academic who has spent decades exploring the intersections of African and Caribbean political ideologies, social movements, and cultural history. His work is highly regarded for its depth and insight, for highlighting the global impact of Garveyism and the enduring significance of Pan-Africanism in contemporary society. Through his extensive research, publications, and public lectures, Professor Lewis continues to contribute to the dialogue on the interconnected histories and futures of Africa and the Caribbean. He is a former research fellow of the PJ Patterson Institute. In fact, he was the first research fellow of the PJ Patterson Institute. Professor Lewis, I want to welcome you in a special way to the podcast series. I want to begin by asking you what motivates you to put so much into your field.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Paulette Ramsay. I'm honored to be interviewed by you. I would begin with my background as a Baptist minister's son.
Interesting.
And the Baptist movement was initiated by an African American, George Liele, in the 18th century, and then continued by British Baptists. My father therefore comes out of that tradition of both George Liele and the British Baptists. And he became a leader in the Baptist Church in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and was in the early 1950s president of Jamaica Baptist Union. From a small farming background in St. Elizabeth, I was always influenced by the fact that we came out of the tradition of peasant struggles and emancipation.
Okay.
That was all around us, wherever we went, whether it was St. James, whether it was Falmouth, which was a big location for us because the Baptist Church, named in honor of William Knibb, is a crucial area, as well as Duncan's, part of the circuit that was very strong in the establishment of 19th century free villages.
Yes.
And the struggle to get the vote to the black population in the 19th century. So that history of the Baptist Church was formative for me. In addition, my father was at the transition point of the movement from white English Baptist ministers to black Baptist ministers. And in the Port Antonio Baptist Church, when he took over in the early 1950s, he was succeeding a British Baptist. So I was witness to a transition.
Yes.
That was part of the independence transition, but people focus a lot on the political, national.
Yes.
But in the parishes, there were transitions that were happening, which helped to influence how I thought about the Jamaican nation and our responsibilities.
Yes. So you went from St. Elizabeth to Port Antonio?
No, I went from, the family went from St. James.
Okay.
In fact, P.J. Patterson was, as a young boy, was a member of my father's church in Bethel in St. James.
And in his book, he writes that he boarded with your parents.
Yes, he did.
Yes,
He did.
yes. It's interesting, the connections among, you know, all of
And
us.
it's cemented by the fact that Calabar Theological College was where my father attended.
Okay.
Then I attended Calabar High School, which was founded in 1912 by the Baptists.
Yes.
So, in speaking about the work that I have been involved in, it is inevitable that I'm going to speak about the Baptist formation because I credit them with the educational foundation
Yes.
that I had.
Yes. That's interesting. So what is it that has kept you motivated to continue to produce research along this path?
Yeah. I first was told that I heard about Garvey from my mother.
Yes.
And my mother was a music teacher at Titchfield High School. And she was also a Baptist minister's wife who played the organ, conducted the choir. So music was her life.
Yes.
She also taught in Moortown when they're building a school there. So she had experience in different parts of Portland,
Yes.
Moortown being one. And then the period of Jamaican nationalism of the early 1960s. We had Louise Bennett, the Frats Quintet, which was an important group of men coming out of the East Queen Street Baptist Church that were singing Jamaican folk songs and performing in the Jamaican cultural tradition.
Yes.
So my mother was a part of that cultural movement. And that naturally influenced me. My father was involved not only in preaching, but in building churches. And he rebuilt the Port Antonio Baptist Church. He built churches in Drapers, in Fellowship. And that kind of work that he did, which was both theological and building and counseling and encouraging young people in the church to get an education. At the time, there's also a big out migration of people on the Windrush. So we could hear the ships coming in, the banana boats,
Yes.
and church members going, migrating. So it was a period of opening opportunities. And naturally, the history of Jamaica, of which we felt a part. Because when I lived in Falmouth, in the same premises that William Nib lived in, there were archival materials downstairs.
Okay.
So Jamaican history was not for me something distant, but it was part of what my family was engaged in.
Yes.
I'm coming from a family, the Monteiths on my mother's side, they were involved in education,
Yes.
in teaching. Some of them had fought in World War I and returned to Jamaica to participate in national life. So in that sense, the social and cultural environment in which I grew up stimulated the interest in the work that I have undertaken.
All that is so interesting and tempting me to go into that area. But I want to come back to the development of Black thought in Jamaica, in the region. Who, other than yourself, would you say are the leading scholars who have driven that development?
I would say Robert Hill, with the multi-volume documentation of the Garvey movement in over 13 volumes now, and other things that he has written. We were both graduate students in the Department of Government in the 1960s, mid-19 to late 1960s, and both did theses on the Garvey movement. There was Professor Tony Martin, who died in 2013, who was also, I would say, a pioneer in that field. However, the decade of the 1960s was a decade of Black Power.
Yes.
The most significant event that took place in the 1960s was the visit of Emperor Haile Selassie to Jamaica in 1966. No other event stimulated the interest of the Jamaican population as did that visit by Emperor Haile Selassie. He visited Trinidad because he was invited by Eric Williams, Prime Minister of Trinidad. Visited Barbados, he visited Jamaica, and he visited Haiti. But the Jamaican visit was the most tumultuous.
Yes.
The airport was taken over by Rastafari. They came from all over the island. And Haile Selassie's trip from Kingston to Montego Bay by rail, he was met at all the stops by literally hundreds of people. And that's now been documented in a manuscript I'm reading for Duke University, which chronicles that visit.
Okay.
The second most important event was the October 16th mass protests against the banning of Dr. Walter Rodney. And I was involved in organizing that protest as a student. I was involved in the Black Power movement on the campus and was active with Walter Rodney. And that, I say, would be the second most important and consequential political act in the 1960s. There were other events in the 1960s, but I would identify those two.
Yes.
Now, the other event which took place in 1970 was the Trinidad Black Power Revolt of 1970. So what you have within the entire region is an uprising that was expressing its concern with the lack of progress for Black people throughout the entire region. So that the young people of that era were calling for several things. They were calling for the extension of education and its reinterpretation to fit the goals of decolonization. I think secondly, they were calling for the development and opportunities for Blacks in business and for the discrimination against Black people within the financial system. And thirdly, they were calling for the lifting of the banning on Black books. Jamaican government had banned all the writings of Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, a number of Black authors. So people were in a period of elevated consciousness about who they were. An aspect of this was that Walter Rodney's wife, Patricia Rodney, who later became a public health expert and wrote on the public health in the Caribbean. She had an afro, and this afro stimulated the interest of women on the campus because there was a lot of discrimination against both the black skin and the way black women presented themselves.
Yes.
So there was a critique of the psychological way in which colonialism had affected black self-image and how people saw themselves. So Walter Rodney and Pat Rodney need to be paired as part of the way people saw the leadership of the movement at that time.
It's interesting that I have never heard her name mentioned in any of the discourse about Walter Rodney and his contributions to the movement for black awakening, black consciousness raising, and so on. I think most of us simply thought of, would that have been before Angela Davis? I'm talking specifically.
Contemporaneous with Angela Davis. So she, in her own right,
yes,
the way she, her image with her afro.
yes,
And you have to remember that in those days when black intellectuals went abroad, got a PhD, they invariably brought back a white wife.
yes.
Now, this was a black PhD who came back to teach here, and he had his girlfriend from Guyana, a black woman,
Yes.
Pursuing her degree in the health system.
Yes.
So for the students at the time, both were important figures.
Yes.
And for our women, for the young women at the time, how Pat's demeanor and her articulate characteristic meant that people were seeing a couple. They
Yes.
were not only seeing the male side of the couple.
Yes, yes. That's interesting. One of the questions that I was going to come to later on, but since you have mentioned him, was about Dr. Walter Rodney himself and what you consider to be the relevance of his teachings now in the 21st century, in academic discourse and so on.
Yes. Well, Walter at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 1960s was involved in development studies.
Yes, yes,
How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, his key book,
yes,
was an attempt to provide a perspective on why African development had faltered.
Mm-hmm.
At the 15th to the beginning of the 16th century, Africa and Europe were generally at similar levels of economic development.
yes, yes.
Two factors hindered Africa's development. One factor was the transatlantic slave trade, which had disastrous consequences in that the young people of the continent, in millions of them, were forcibly transferred across the Atlantic to work on the plantations of the Americas.
Yes.
The second event was the partitioning of Africa in the 1880s and the colonization project by Britain, France, Germany, and other countries, Belgium and other countries. Walter goes to show how development Africa went into retrogression.
Yes.
He showed us how even within the transatlantic slave trade, the business people who were investing in African labor took people from particular areas, in rice growing areas in the Senegambia, because African labor had skills, and these skills were then redeployed within the plantation system. He says that development is inherent in any society, and he goes on to show, particularly in the metal industry, metallurgy, and recent research and research done by scholars here have indicated the metallurgical skills that Africans brought from the continent, because they have been involved in metallurgy for over 1,000 years, and how those skills were deployed in the industrial processes in the factories on the plantation. So that he demonstrates in how Europe developed Africa the processes of the international capitalist system that delayed African development. So that African industries were crushed, whether it is in the cloth weaving industries, whether it is in metallurgical trades, whether it is, of course, there was no financial structure that was accessible to black entrepreneurs. So he then goes on to a critique of colonial governance, to show that colonial governance was basically geared towards benefiting the metropole. But he went on further to argue that through education, the post-colonial development could be enhanced. But then you did not want to develop an elite that would simply replace the colonial grouping. And therefore one had to give some thought to the mode in which new governance systems could be developed that would benefit the population. Of course, in the 1960s, the former imperial powers were, having been forced to grant political independence, developed other mechanisms in the post-World War II period which hampered the development of politically independent states. The P.J. Patterson Institute over time, and P.J. Patterson himself, they have spoken of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the development of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all the mechanisms which the forces that won World War II developed and which continue into the 21st century as mechanisms to benefit Europe and the United States, that alliance, as against the countries that have evolved. So Walter Rodney's work revised Marxism in a fundamental way, because he factored in the race situation. And race is an important part of our history. The Catherine Hall, the historian, has written a book recently called Lucky Valley, and she has studied the works of Edward Long, the British judge of the 18th century, as well as someone who wrote the history of Jamaica. And she has documented the racial ideology that was developed and how that racial ideology was deployed to develop the system of white superiority and black inferiority, and how that method was transferred to different parts of the world as the method for ensuring black subordination.
Podcast on Walter Rodney, but I want to go back to Marcus Garvey, because many of us know that most of your research, you have contributed extensively to the research on Marcus Garvey, on his political thought, on his ideas of race and the development of African diaspora societies. What would you say is the most or are the most enduring aspects of Garvey's legacy?
I think, first of all, the psychological aspect. When the odds are against you, tremendous odds against you, but you can see beyond those odds to goals that the people around you can't see.
Yes.
And you work towards those goals, but not only you work towards those goals, but you bring millions of people into a vision of their possibility.
Yes.
That psychological achievement of Garvey is absolutely exceptional. Because there is nothing at the time when he started the Universal Negro Improvement Association African Communities League, which indicated that you could have a black nation, because white nations dominated the world. They dominated Asia, they dominated Africa, they dominated the Americas. So you have to have some sense of historical process to be speaking, and this is why people thought he was crazy.
Yes.
The second aspect, and for him, the mind.
Yes.
Garvey develops a philosophy of the mind and a philosophy of the black mind that draws from the ancient history of African civilizations. You can't think that way if you are restricted by the plantation history of the 15th and 16th centuries coming down. So he's drawing on ancestral wisdom.
Yes.
I think secondly is his ability to deploy the methods of capitalism for black people.
Yes.
And what the Chinese have done, although they have a socialist revolution, but the Chinese have deployed capitalism, regulated by their state. And Garvey recognized that you had to develop the business side. And the African Communities League was incorporated in 1918 to do a range of things, to do trade, to do commerce, to do film, to do, it was, when you look at the incorporation legal documents, there is no economic activity which he was not geared towards preparing black people for. And hence the Black Star shipping line was a platform for trade. There had been other shipping lines that had been developed. He was not the first black person to develop that, but he was the first to initiate that Black Star line within the context of a social movement or a racial movement of black people. The other aspect of him would be the political aspects, and within the United States, where blacks had the right to vote, he said the Negro Political Union would support those candidates, because blacks are a minority in the United States, whose programs are best in the interest of the black population. Where blacks were in a majority, even under the colonial period, Garvey initiated the People's Political Party in Jamaica. And the program of that party, with respect to you take three aspects of that program. You take the aspect of a land reform, which Jamaica has never done. And countries that have made transitions in the post-war period, South Korea and others, have had extensive land reform. Garvey was dead right on his focus in that area. Then the focus on education. both the development of not only the primary base, but the development of high schools and the development of university. Of course, he was ridiculed at the time because people say you can go to England and study. What is this point of developing university in Jamaica? It was bound to be a backwater institution. And he was criticized for that. But he held to the view that you had to develop the institutions that would enhance the capabilities of your population. Thirdly, in the cultural area, Garvey was very keen on film. And there were initiatives in the United States to develop black filmmaking, and discussions also in Jamaica at Edelweeds Park, where he got visiting directors from Hollywood who were passing through on ships to stop and talk about filmmaking in Jamaica. He was also involved in theater, having written 7 plays. So I regard him as multi-talented.
Yes.
And a genius in his capacity to function in very distinct modalities.
Yes.
But all of this is harnessing all the modalities necessary for the progress of black people.
Yes.
But he could not have done this without the support of the women in the Garvey movement.
Yes.
And my young colleague, Dr. Nathaniel Duncan, is publishing a book that should be out early 2025 called Efficient Womanhood, the study of women in the UNIA, which will make a breakthrough in the historiography of women in the movement. Because we have to go beyond Garvey's 2 extraordinary wives. The Amy Ashwoods
Yes.
and Amy Jakes
Yes.
played important roles. But to understand the other women, hundreds of women and thousands of women in the different divisions of the United States, in the Caribbean
Yes.
and elsewhere,
Yes.
who were active and influenced by the movement.
So they would be going to Cuba.
Cuba,
I've seen the, rebuilt UNI
Yes.
building in Banis, in Costa Rica.
Costa Rica,
On,
yes.
I'm not sure if there's one in Bluefields,
I'm not sure about Bluefields.
but all these places where
Mhm.
Jamaicans traveled to and followed the teachings of Garvey.
Mhm.
What would you say is the relevance today of Garvey's economic philosophy?
Yeah, I think that is the dimension of his philosophy that is most relevant today. Because wherever you have black populations, you have degrees of poverty
Yes.
and degrees of wealth, and therefore inequality in black population. Any part of Africa you go, in the Caribbean, in the US, it's not that you don't have black wealth, you do have black wealth, but the black poverty is not commensurate
Yes.
with levels of living that are standards by which you'd want to have social development. And given Africa has a very young population, very young youth population, the technological revolution that is underway, and some say we are at the beginning of the phase of that technological revolution, means that we have to rethink the way we go about economic activity, so that our young people can not only be practitioners of the existing technology, but be placed in a position through education to be innovators and to have access to capital,
Yes.
to generate the wealth for the new projects that will come.
Yes.
Projects in infrastructure, projects in health and education, projects in manufacturing. We have to think in the 21st century, drawing on the Garvey legacy in a much more ambitious way than the generation of political independence. So I would say that this, for me, is the key aspect of the legacy, because Garvey was very clear that if you can control the political order, but if you don't run the economic base of that political order, you're going to be subject to the powers that be who control the economic base.
He was way ahead of his time.
Way ahead of his time.
It's an amazing intellect, you know. I want to talk a little about younger generations and the sort of connection that your generation and the other scholars in your time who have done so much work on Garvey and his political thought and so on. How can the conversation between your generation and younger generation, I'm talking about the generation of people in their 30s and so on, really young ones, who are not aware. In Jamaica, for instance, they know that he's one of our national heroes, but I don't think that there is enough effort being made in the schools to make our young people aware of the enormity of his contributions, of how relevant his ideas are today, especially in terms of empowering black people.
Yeah, that's an extremely important question. That's an extremely important question. I have been working with a Garvey Schools project led by Major Ephraim White that has been active in over 30 schools, early childhood schools, and is now making some transition to working in the high schools.
Yes.
And we have a team of people who are skilled in, qualified in curricular research, and in preparing materials for different levels of the educational system. We are hoping to expand that work and to collaborate with the Ministry of Education to ensure, and we have in fact done the textbooks for the early childhood level on Garvey and on financial education. So we're linking the two at the early childhood level, giving students knowledge not only of Garvey, but of finance, how you go about finance, thinking about finance, even creating wealth, 5 to 7 year old. So those two texts have been done, and they have been piloted in over 30 early childhood schools. So we're presently in discussion with the Ministry of Education. So one has to find different nodal points of bringing people together with different skills. So I act more as a consultant, but you need people who are trained in particularly age group curriculum development. We also need to consider how social media relates to education, because young people access social media in ways that previous generations had no clue about. So our group is thinking and working along these lines. As far as the older people who are researching areas that are aligned with my interests, the key thing here is to be responsive to reading what they are writing. So I've been involved in reading manuscripts by a number of younger scholars, being receptive to their work, because you know, it's not only that they will read or have read or seen what you have written, but a younger generation is now producing.
Yes, yes.
And therefore one has to be receptive to responding and encouraging them as they go along the journey of intellectual discovery and developing themes which the previous generation had not tackled, and the new issues that arise in the 21st century world.
Your personal, so we've gleaned quite a bit about the early Pan-Africanist movement and Garvey's contribution to that movement and so on. I know that we've come into a sort of new paradigm now, referred to as global Africa. What is your personal concept, definition of global Africa?
Global Africa was developed on the planet. Global Africa was developed on the plantation, and you could almost say developed on the slave ship. Global Africa is when people from different parts of the continent, from different ethnic groups, were forced into community. And in being forced into community, they were able to constitute new types of relations. The best example I can provide of that is marriage. Marriage is the basis for global Africa, because marriage is about freedom, and marriage is about freedom of a group of people who may have had black skins, come from Africa, but culturally they were not part of the same nation. So therefore, your Yorubas, your Kikongos, your Efiks, your Senegambia people, all of these people now developed these Creole languages, this new way of communicating, drawing from their past, but forging a new identity. And the question of creating this new community develops in the migratory patterns that were established in the post-slavery period. And in the migratory patterns, whether it's Panama, whether it's the United States, wherever people happen to have gone, they create these new communities. And therefore, to come back to the Garvey movement, what you get in the Garvey movement is the coalescence of consciousness over ourselves as black people. And this coalescence of self as black people comes about at a time of severe racial oppression. Okay. And you have to try to find a way out of this. Marriage, therefore, and the transition to political independence and nation state, particularly in the case of the political elite that emerged, whether it is London or Paris or any of these capitals that political aspirants went to for education, and later developed groups and organizations that led independence movements. Patrice Lumumba in Belgium, or Leopold Senghor in Paris, or Frantz Fanon in the Algerian War coming out of Martinique. Kwame Nkrumah in the United States and encountering the Garvey vision, you therefore find here these are the political aspirants and the theorizers of how the black condition can be revolutionized. And the aspirations then develop into nationalist movements. And today we're in a position where the 20th century has largely been the century of black political freedom. And the 21st century has to be the century of black economic freedom and black cultural assertiveness. The creativity is an important part of how we see ourselves, of how our inner life is given value by ourselves. And that's a different but related agenda to the economic agenda. Because you can have the economic agenda, but if you don't have the spiritual side, you can go awry. Yes. And you can, because part of the way global elites run now is not simply through economic mechanisms, but through cultural mechanisms. Yes. And these cultural mechanisms that have been at the basis of modern technology mean that we have to pay much more attention to our inner lives or inner space than hitherto thought. You know, the big thing in the past was the political, getting state power. So that's not enough. You have to get economic base, but you also have to have some spiritual space. Who are we? And that's where the artists, the writers, filmmakers, and other creators enable us to find ourselves in a complicated world.
To show that it has to be a sort of multi-layered, multi-dimensional project agenda. So I would want to ask you then, does all of this collaboration and this attempt to define global Africa and work towards achieving this concept called global Africa revision or reversion the black identity? Are we simultaneously creating a new way of defining the black identity?
Well, black identity is never a fixed factor.
Yes.
Well, black identity is never a fixed factor.
Yes.
It's evolving.
Yes.
And it's changing over time. So what was black identity for Garvey, what was black identity in the 60s with Rastas, it's not necessarily going to be the same black identity in the 2020s. Yes. So the evolution of the self, but the struggle to ensure that that self is consonant with human values is now a huge struggle given the world in which we live, where the basic struggle at this moment is over the human values that will govern mankind. What are the values that this global African identity will be promoting?
Yes. Well, we have, I would love to continue because there's so many things we have touched on. I would have loved to talk more about the contribution of women to the Pan-Africanist movement, but, you know, especially women who were, it would be at two different stages. Women who were with Garvey, and then the influence of women like Walter Rodney's wife to this broad movement. We've had you share so much from your vast wealth of knowledge. I think we're going to have to bring you back to share with us and share with our audience. But I think we have to come to a close now, and I want to thank you.
Thank you very much
for your great insights, for your generosity in sharing your knowledge. And I look forward to learning more from you, and I'm sure the audience will enjoy all the lessons that you have shared today. Thank you very much.